ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
This conversation includes content that may be sensitive for some listeners.
Today my guest is Lindsey Fidler, no relation. Lindsey's a sociologist, and today she works as a senior policy analyst in Tasmania. But Lindsey grew up in the UK, in East Anglia. She was brought up by her parents, Valerie and Colin. It was a lively, working-class home with lots of laughter and music. But Lindsey and her brother knew something was a little odd. They were led to believe that Colin was their biological dad, and they accepted that, even though they looked so different from him. Lindsey ended up becoming a sociologist, and she even wrote a thesis on mixed-race children. But even then, she didn't let herself understand the truth about herself. And it wasn't until a letter arrived from a spiteful relative that Lindsey was given her real family history. And she set herself the task of tracking down her biological father, wherever he was in the world. Hi, Lindsey.
Hello.
You grew up in Peterborough in East Anglia. What's that area like? Tell me about that part of the world.
Peterborough is a very working-class city on the edge of the Fens, the Fenlands.
What are the Fenlands?
The Fenlands are a huge corner of the UK, which is swamplands and they're lowlands, big skies, totally flat all the way to Holland. The roads have been carved out in these straight lines with big dikes either side of them. It's very insular because you don't go through East Anglia, you just go to it.
What does a Fenlander accent sound like?
I'm not going to do one because I'm not very good at accents.
Have a go.
Well, it sounds like, you got a light boy? Which would mean, have you got a lighter, my friend?
Right, no, I didn't hear that.
So it's sort of a cut rural accent, but it's very of the area. Nowhere else sounds like the Fens. It's not a well-known part of the UK.
Tell me about your mum, Valerie, what she looked like to your young eyes as a kid growing up in Peterborough.
She was, as most people do, I always thought my mum was beautiful. And, she had this she was always very well dressed and she had beautiful blonde hair, always well manicured, always with a face full of makeup, these beautiful dresses that she'd wear or cut jeans with a T-shirt. She just always looked fabulous, really. Even a friend said to me once, even your mum's dressing gown is elegant. She was just gorgeous. She's a very gentle soul.
Is she quick to laugh?
She was a giggler. She was a giggler and a sigher. They were sort of two things, but she was also quite shy. So that took a lot of getting out of her. If you were in her space, she was wonderful, but she could be quite quiet if she was out in public. She wasn't a big conversationalist with strangers.
Now, how about Colin, the man she was married to? What was he like?
He was interesting. His parents were publicans. Sylvia and Harry, they owned lots of pubs around the area. And they used to take in lodgers, so sort of musicians and actors that were visiting the Peterborough area, they'd take in. So he grew up in a totally different environment to Val. Very gregarious. He would talk the hind leg off a donkey and he loved a joke. So he was always the life and soul of the party. He had a really deep love of jazz as well. He grew up in the late 50s and the early 60s, the big area of bebop, the classic era of bebop. John Coltrane,
Miles Davis,
Sonny Rollins, and then all the British jazz musicians that were coming up then. That's when Ronnie Scott's opened, so he'd go down to Ronnie Scott's a lot.
Was he a stylish guy as well?
Well, it's interesting because I was born in 69, so by the 70s, he'd become a big safari suit wearer. So that was his style by then.
That's the acme of style, I think. It doesn't get better than a safari suit on a trim man, I think, with some walk socks and some sandals.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, with a muzzy
right.
And a bit of a curly afro. Right. But in the photos of him in the 50s and 60s, he'd wear a cravat and had sort of a Buddy Holly type hair.
Like a quiff, right.
Yeah, with thick rimmed glasses. He was just such a chatter.
And what did he do for work?
Well, he was a typewriter engineer and he'd gone to Italy to study with Olivetti at the point where they opened their big new town, really. A bit like Italian Cadbury's, where they create a whole city that trains its workers to not only be good technicians, but also introduce them to music and art. He went to Italy when he was about 19 or 20 and lived there while he trained with Olivetti, and then came back to the UK and took over the world, really. He became the Typewriter King into the 70s.
He was known as the Typewriter King?
He was known as the Typewriter King. So he had contracts, obviously around the Peterborough area, but all into the Fenlands and down into London, with some royalty as well. And importantly for our story, also all the American Air Force bases that were in the Fens.
Sorry, he was by royal appointment the fixer of the Royal Typewriters?
Yes. Yeah, he got about.
How was it that he and your mum started going to the local Air Force base regularly in Peterborough?
So he would be signed in by friends onto the American Air Force Base, and they would go there to listen to music, to go and dance, to go and watch baseball.
This was when your mum met Morris.
Yes.
Tell me how she met Morris.
Well, Morris, he was an American Air Forceman. He just arrived and had his Mustang shipped over and had driven his Mustang to the base.
Wow.
Friends of his, who had signed Mum and Dad in, introduced Morris to Colin and Val. And from that point on, it was Morris who was signing them into the base. My mum liked to dance. Val loved to dance. Colin didn't. He liked to chat. So quite often when they go to the base, he would dance with Val while Colin chatted. On one occasion, she asked Morris to dance, and as he said, she got a little closer than normal, which he wasn't displeased about.
Morris was African-American.
Yes.
And he sounds like he was quite beautiful.
Yes.
What kind of an impact did he make on your mum?
She fell in love with him. I think she was pretty swept away by him. He was a very beautiful man and a very physically imposing man. He was big, tall, and had a beautiful voice, very southern drawl. She just fell in love with the whole package, I think. But I think what was also going through her mind at that point was she was 29 when she met Morris, and she and Colin hadn't been able to have children because she didn't know when Colin and her married that Colin couldn't have children. And although that wasn't an issue for her when they married, as the years went by, it did become an issue for her. She felt she really wanted children. So this sort of, fairly meek woman decided to take matters into her own hands.
And so she became pregnant with you.
Yeah.
This was the late 60s.
Yes.
How scandalous was this liaison? Or were they able to keep it going in secret?
Well, they did. They kept it going in secret.
So did she have to have you in secret then?
She did, yeah. So she, obviously, when she became pregnant, it was clear it wasn't Colin's because Colin couldn't have children. So she obviously had to tell Colin that she was pregnant. So they split. She moved with her mum and dad. And it was incredibly scandalous. It was right in that period of forced adoptions where any woman who was having kids out of wedlock was having illegitimate children.
And was she considering having you put up for adoption?
Yeah, she did. The arrangement was to have me adopted. So she went to Stamford to have me, which is a little market town outside Peterborough, but away from prying eyes, I guess. From what I understand, the arrangement was that I would be adopted out.
But then you were born and she had this beautiful baby girl in her arms.
Yeah, and it's a little bit unclear exactly what happened at this point. I understand that I was given for adoption. The Adoption Act meant that mothers couldn't give their children away for 6 weeks after birth. So I was with her for 6 weeks. She gave me to foster parents, and then there was a little known sort of loophole in the Adoption Act, which meant that parents who were adopting kids couldn't adopt them until 3 months. And usually mothers weren't told about that. They just thought once they'd given their kids away, that was it. It was just one of those things that wasn't mentioned to help adoptions go through. But I think with my mum, she was able to convince social services that if she returned to a stable marriage, she could have me back.
So what kind of an arrangement did she make with Colin then?
Well, it was just that. I would return to live with Colin and that she wouldn't see Maurice.
Did she see Maurice?
She did see Maurice, yes. She told me that after a while it felt unfair for him not to see me. So she started to, in secret, go to Huntingdon, near Alconbury where he lived. And that was aided by her best friend. They'd say to Colin and her partner that they were going to London on a shopping trip. And what they'd actually do is take me to see Maurice.
Colin must have suspected. I wonder if there was a bit of a don't ask, don't tell policy going on there.
It's possible. I mean, he was always really clear that he really wanted kids. So, you know, you're willing to turn a blind eye sometimes, aren't you, to behaviour when you want to create the world you want.
So he'd come to really love you like a daughter by then, Colin?
Yes, he was really clear about that. You know, I was his daughter and he wanted children.
So you have a brother as well?
I do, yeah.
Is he also Maurice's son?
Yes, Hayden is Maurice's son too. So in those visits that my mum was making back to Maurice, she fell pregnant again. So
another awkward conversation, right?
Yeah, so she obviously had to have another conversation, as she said.
But in your mind, you're the natural-born daughter of Colin and Valerie at this stage.
Well, I can remember Mum went back to live with her parents. I remember living with my grandparents. I remember sitting on the stairs and my mum going to hospital to have Hayden. I remember her leaving the house to have Hayden, which is why I always knew, like, she's my mum. I know she's my mum. I just can't put the rest of the puzzle together.
But you're only 3 at this point.
Yeah, I know.
So this must be one of your earliest memories then.
Yes. But
you and Hayden were brought back into the family home with Colin?
Well, not immediately. So we lived, I remember, like, Mum, Hayden and I lived together until we were about 5, until I was about 5, I should say. During that period, Maurice returned to the States and he wanted my mum to go to the States with him.
But you didn't know that, of course, at the time.
No, we didn't know that.
So the offer was made.
Yeah.
Did she consider taking up Maurice on his offer?
Yes,
so why didn't she in the end?
Well, she said she was getting so much flack from the community around. I mean, you can imagine a white woman having 2 mixed-race kids in the late 60s, early 70s, in a community where it's very clear that she's had an affair. So she was a pariah, really, in the local community, as we were. We were a scandal. So
but why wouldn't you want to leave under those circumstances?
She said she couldn't leave her parents. I think she saw her parents as sort of a safe harbour. And the world was a very big place to her, and she was quite shy. So it felt she just didn't want to leave.
But how were those parents with you? Were they loving to you, or were you the fruits of a disgraceful relationship on their mind?
My mum's mum and dad, Charlie and Flo, were just beautiful. They were just so loving. You know, they just wrapped us in love, really. With lots of piano playing by Charlie and lots of sewing and knitting with my nan. I mean, they were lovely. Absolutely lovely.
What about Colin's parents?
They were less impressed, as you can imagine. So Harry and Sylvia, Harry was always cold, and I just didn't understand why. He would never hug, never look at us. He'd make snide comments about black people quite regularly.
And he's your grandpa, supposedly.
Yeah. Sylvia, I think as an adult now, I think she was probably a bit more torn because we copped a lot of flack from adults around us.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what was it like when you were being pushed around in a stroller by your mum in the streets of Peterborough?
Well, they lost a lot of friends because of us, really. People would ask whether we were my mums, And there would be others who would just avoid us. We had a neighbour who was just awful to us, to be honest.
To you kids?
To us and our mums. Like, it would start with things like you'd throw, a ball would go over the fence and it would never get returned. It would start with things like that. I remember one day, I think I was about 8, where we'd been playing in the garden and, shouting. We were with friends, I'm sure. And then our neighbour started shouting at my mum, saying, "Get those kids indoors. That girl of yours is like a bitch on heat." I was about 8.
Was this surprisingly common? Maybe comments not as directly nasty as that, but were you often the subject of passive-aggressive, nasty, backhanded racism?
Yes. I mean, it's at that point in the UK, as in most places, I'd imagine, like being mixed race wasn't something that was celebrated. It was seen as a little bit of an embarrassment to a lot of families.
Embarrassment's one thing, but a goad to make obnoxious comments to little kids is something else, isn't it?
Well, yes, you'd think so, with our heads on, but not at that point. I mean, white women who were having babies with black men was seen as whores, and that's what my mum was often described as.
But you don't have any memory of Morris, and you thought Colin was your father. Did this strike you as strange then? What did you make of all this? And also, you're looking in the mirror on a daily basis. Yeah. What were you thinking at the time? Do you remember?
Well, cognitive dissonance is an extremely powerful thing. So you want to believe your parents. So there was a part of us that was clearly saying, okay, well, you're our mum and dad, and you're telling us you're our mum and dad. Even though our skin's darker than you, that must be the case.
So what mum and dad tell you, that's like the foundation of truth in the world, I suppose, isn't it?
It is. You trust that. Again, it's your safety zone. It's your safe harbour. You're going to believe your parents. But as we grew, it was quite clear that we were treated as black. So we go somewhere like King's Lynn, which was a bit of a safe haven of the National Front at that point. And people would say, "What are you doing here?" Or call us a black bee, or, So it was really clear by then to me that something wasn't right. It goes into self-loathing, doesn't it? I didn't look like anybody around me. I didn't understand what was happening. It was actually Sylvia, so Colin's mum, who I asked, "Why is our skin so dark?" And so she told us we were a genetic throwback.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but
no,
that's just the silliest thing in the world. Dear, you're a genetic throwback.
Yes, both of us are a genetic.
Right, both of you. And meanwhile, this is the time when, racial issues are actually being played out really interestingly on British TV. There are series like Love Thy Neighbour and the like. What happened when you saw black people on TV or in magazines?
Well, I related to them. I looked like them. I could see that there was a connection, but I just didn't understand what the connection was or how. There was half of me that was saying, well, these are my parents. They're both white. I'm white. I'm a genetic throwback from somewhere down the heritage of one of them. And so is my brother. And then there was another half of me that was saying, this can't be right. So once I was sort of 11, 12, 13, I started to buy Black Hair and Beauty. And
was that a magazine?
It was a magazine, and it was delivered monthly to the house. Val and Colin didn't question it. They didn't say, why are you buying that? They just went with it.
They weren't saying anything to you, but they were waiting for you to figure it out yourself.
They had no tools to talk about racism, weren't prepared for it. And secondly, they were trying to hold on to their sense of reality that they'd created, that we were theirs.
Tell me about the teacher who introduced you to sociology.
Sandra Bush.
You're beaming as you say her name.
I am. She was just such a generous human being, not just to me, but to lots of kids. She was my religious education teacher. It wasn't a religious school, but we still did RE. And she just saw something in me. She recognised, she didn't ever talk about my identity, although I asked her questions. about when we were doing things like what was happening in South Africa, and we were talking about apartheid, and I remember asking her, well, where would I fit? So, she was sort of taking me through those journeys, those identity journeys, without bursting the bubble that my parents had created. I was really interested in doing sociology, as were 5 other students. So when we got to what we called O-levels, there was a choice then of, if we wanted to do sociology, we would have to go to the college. We couldn't stay in the school to do what we called our sixth form. So Sandra spent that summer holiday training in sociology, put on the first sociology O-level and A-level in the school ever for us to go through, to keep us at the school, me and 5 other students. We were all like working class kids.
And she spotted you as bright and inquisitive.
She did. And then when it came to thinking about next steps, like nobody in my family has ever been to university. It wasn't a thing. But she encouraged me to think about university. So she sat with me and looked at all the options, like where I might want to go. She helped me with the application. When I got a place at Leicester University to do sociology, she'd check in on me. She'd write me letters. When I came back to Peterborough, she'd take me out to dinner. She kept me on this path to get me through whatever messy life was happening.
So you got into Leicester Uni, in the Midlands, isn't it, Leicester?
Leicester's in the East Midlands. It's only 40 miles from Peterborough.
Right, but it was a whole world different, wasn't it? Leicester's a big multicultural city, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's one of the reasons I chose Leicester, for that reason. It's a very big multicultural city.
And as a working class kid, what was it like meeting rich kids at uni for the first time?
Just blew my mind. I had no idea that this world existed, really. These kids that, I was meeting friends who had London pads and country pads. And
were they nice or were they patronising? Were they like, well done you, coming from...
Well, some were very patronising, but there was a couple of friends I made who were wonderful. They were just really good, but they would then take me down to London and I'd go to Holland Park, and their friends who had all gone to, St Paul's or Eton or places like that, they would sit me in a room and ask me questions about how I grew up and my neighbourhood. What was it like being working class? What was it like growing up on a council estate? They were fascinated by the idea that they had the opportunity to talk to this working class species sitting in their privileged bubble. It was interesting.
You met black people there at Leicester Uni. What did that do for you?
Well, I should say when I was growing up in Peterborough, there was a really big Afro-Caribbean community. They were amazing. They'd taken me in, even though a lot of them knew what my backstory was, but didn't tell me because they didn't want to, burst that bubble. But they totally embraced me. I'd sort of found a culture that wasn't necessarily mine, but was a safe haven. And so going to Leicester, I just extended that, joined the Afro-Caribbean Society. I've just lived for jazz and reggae, really, ever since I've been young. And so I just continued that.
Now, in your third year of your sociology degree, you wrote a thesis, and this totally blows my mind. Tell me about the thesis you wrote in third year uni, please.
So my thesis was on mixed race identity.
You wrote a thesis on mixed race identity as a mixed race person who had not yet clocked the fact that you were not in your conscious mind that you were mixed race. Yeah.
I think it probably speaks to why I did sociology, really, is that sociology gives you a great framework for understanding people.
Now, that's sociology, but I think we have to go into the realm of psychology here, and neither you or I are psychologists, I hasten to add. But do you suspect that there was part of your mind saying, Lindsey, attend to this, there's something going on here, can't you see what's right in front of your face in the mirror?
Yeah. By that stage, I was talking about myself as being mixed race, even though I was still talking about Val and Colin were my parents. It was pure cognitive dissonance. All I can do is describe it because that's where I was at. So I did this piece of research where I interviewed lots of mothers who had had mixed-race kids, about how they nurture their children's identity across two different cultures. I spoke to kids about how they saw themselves as mixed race, how that manifests itself. Did all this. Obviously, it was before computers, so everything had to be typed up. My mum was a typist. So we sat together. I'd be writing, and then she would be the other side typing out my thesis.
Your mum was typing up this thesis?
Yeah, she typed up the thesis.
She knows your story and she still hasn't told you, but she's typing up this thesis on mixed race identity?
Didn't say, what was encouraging.
It sounds to me like part of you is trying to find out how to be in the world as yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, I was still trying to work out who the hell I was, why I was, why.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
So, you graduate from university in sociology, you've written this thesis on mixed race identity. No one still has told you the truth about who your dad is.
Yes.
And that's when an anonymous letter arrives in the mail.
Yes. So I was 22 when this happened. So one day I got a phone call from my mum. I was teaching. I wasn't living with my parents. She said, Lindsay, you need to take a day off work. You need to come over. My boyfriend at the time, who I was living with, knew about my history. He was a few years older than me, and he'd grown up round the corner. So he knew. And when I got that phone call, he told me afterwards he was pretty sure what was about to happen. I went over to my mum and dad's, and Hayden was there too, obviously, my brother. And this letter had arrived addressed to myself and Hayden. It was anonymous, and it said, now you're of childbearing age, I think you should know that your dad was a coal-black American Air Forceman. And if you have children, I really hope they're not tainted with the same colour.
Who sent that letter?
We're pretty sure it was Harry, our granddad, Colin's dad.
But he didn't put his name to it?
No.
What do you think about him sending that letter?
Well, I have to say, I've been thinking about this. At first, I thought it was a very hateful thing to do. Reflecting on it, I just wonder whether he thought enough is enough. The story needs to be told. He did not do it in a very nice manner. Absolutely. But one thing I am grateful for is that it brought the truth out in terms of our dad.
So when you read that letter, what then did your mum and Colin say?
Well, we sat in their living room and they had to tell us, my mum had to sit there with Colin and tell us about the affairs she'd had. But
she told you about Morris, she told you about the Air Force Base, she told you about the fair, the two pregnancies, she told you the whole thing?
Whole thing, there with Colin.
And how did that feel to be told that?
Lots of different feelings. I mean, my brother Hayden is a bit of a comedian and it takes life very lightly. So when they first said, we're not your biological parents, he just looked at me and looked at them and went, no shit, Sherlock. Which...
That probably made the rest of the conversation a bit easier then.
It did.
Yeah.
He's just brilliant at doing that. He's just so good. Love him to bits. So that did lighten it for us, not for Val.
Right.
No, because they had to sit there and talk about this. And I guess that's when they were, Colin was really clear that he wanted kids. And that was his rationale for not revealing to us that he wasn't our father.
Because he wanted you in his life.
He wanted us. Yeah, he wanted us.
And he was prepared to wear all of that socially to have you in his life.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
Exactly. It was based on love. I mean, it was a shit show in many ways, but it came from love and it came from a sense of wanting a family.
Was there any relief in all this for you?
Huge. I mean, it was, I don't know what I thought the story was going to be, but it was such a relief to hear it. It was such a relief to know that
you weren't a throwback.
We weren't a genetic throwback, yes. And that there was a rational explanation as to why we didn't look like Colin. You know, it was just, I felt a physical release in my body.
Something unclenched.
Yeah, it did. I felt it physically.
Did you then want to go and find Morris, your biological father, having been told this?
Yes, I was very curious. And given the explorations I'd been doing through sociology, I was really keen. And to their absolute credit, Val and Colin said they had no issues if we wanted to try and find Morris. They only had a name. That's all they could give us. But yes, I was really keen. Hayden, he was happy to go along with it. So, yes.
Did you feel, nonetheless, you had to tread lightly in your search?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because you wouldn't have known what Morris's family situation was about.
I had no idea whether he'd remarried, whether he was in another family, whether if he was, he'd told them about us.
So you just can't go crashing onto the front door going, surprise.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how did you start searching for him? It's given that he'd been in the US Air Force, you'd known that. He'd been based in East Anglia, the Air Force base near your family home. But now he was gone. He was presumably back in the United States. That's all you had to work on?
Yeah, we just had a name. And of course, it was before the internet. So we started by trawling through American phone books in the library and writing to families, basically saying, we're looking for a friend of the family. He was in the UK at this time and, you know, this is his name.
And did that work?
I got lots of lovely letters back from families who didn't know him, but were just lovely letters saying they, you know, wished me well in my search. And then I found an organisation called Trace, it's a transatlantic organisation that helps people, a lot of GI kids, find their fathers usually in the States.
And were they more helpful?
Well, they fielded more letters, but still nothing. And then I had a chance conversation one day with a woman in Peterborough who worked at the Multicultural Centre there, who was married to an American Air Forceman. And she said, well, have you thought about getting in touch with the American Air Force International Base Locator, I think it's called, basically the pension fund. If you write to the pension fund, they'll know where he is. He's bound to have updated that address. So I wrote a letter and enclosed a letter to Morris in that letter to say, we'd love if you could pass this on.
Do you remember what you wrote in that letter?
It was still a cautious letter, so I still wrote, we're looking for a friend of the family. We're wondering whether it's you.
And did you sign it by your name?
Yes. I'm Lindsay. My brother is Hayden. Valerie is our mother.
So he would have known straight away you were his daughter?
Yes.
How did he reply?
He called me. So I answered the phone one evening in my flat in Peterborough. I think I was 23 by then. This low southern drawl of a voice said, hello, is that Lindsay? I said, yes. He went, it's Morris. I've been waiting for your letter for 20 years.
So how did you then arrange to meet him?
Well, we had to find a way to get over to the States. I'd gone to do some postgraduate studies. I didn't have that much money, and nor did Hayden.
So how did you come up with the airfare to get to the United States?
Well, fortunately for us at that point, Hoover, the vacuum cleaner company, decided if you bought a vacuum cleaner they would give you 2 free tickets to New York.
Now, Lindsay, I was living in England when this happened. This became a huge story. The Hoover offer you buy a vacuum cleaner and you get 2 free tickets to New York. This is one of the great corporate debacles of modern history.
It absolutely is.
So you bought the Hoover? And
Mum got the Hoover for a Christmas present.
Right. And did you get the 2 free tickets?
Well, we did. I know a lot of people didn't. They tried to dodge giving people tickets because obviously it was a bit oversubscribed. So they were trying. They were
flying off the shelves.
So they were having to arrange flights from just like the most random airports all over the country, and then just offering people them, saying you need to get to Aberdeen,
right?
You know, and it has to be in these dates, and then you can have your tickets. And most people weren't able to do that. But because we, you know, I was studying, Hayden was working, we just said, yeah, we'll grab it. So,
didn't this scheme actually bankrupt the Hoover Corporation in the UK?
It did.
But you got your tickets.
We got tickets.
Oh, so what was it like when you got on the plane to New York then with your Hoover tickets?
Well, it was still the time where you could smoke on planes and drink a lot. Right? So
great days.
Great days, yes. So the plane was, you know, busy and lots of chatter going on. We were sitting next to this lovely nurse from Liverpool who lived in New York. So she was drinking and smoking. We were drinking and smoking. And then the staff would come down and be giving out these drinks. And then we noticed they weren't giving drinks, or they weren't offering drinks to us. And we realised, this woman said, she goes, when she realised we'd got Hoover tickets, the nurse went, they're treating you differently because you have those tickets. I'm going to have a word with them. So she just went for it with this poor hostess, just saying, give them what they want. They're not second-class citizens just because they got their tickets because of a Hoover. So, yes.
Gee, there's been a lot of crappy, spiteful behaviour in your past from other people, Lindsay, I must say.
We just took it in our stride. We were
You got your tickets. So when you got to America, tell me about how you finally met Morris face to face.
Yes. So he paid for us to get to Raleigh, Durham. He was living in Fayetteville in North Carolina at the time. We met in Raleigh, Durham. He put us up for the night in a hotel, and we met him the next morning.
And what was that encounter like? How do you remember seeing him for the first time?
It was really... It's hard to describe.
Tell me what he looked like as he was coming towards you.
I mean, he was quite a stern man. It's hard to describe what it's like to see someone who looks like you for the first time. So Hayden and I were holding hands, and we'd sort of looked at each other before we went through the doors to meet Morris. And I just said to him, it's a life-changing moment. Took a deep breath and went into the dining area, and he was just standing there. He didn't smile. He wasn't a smiler. He was, you know, as his family described him, he was a stern but kind man. So he stood there, and I'm a hugger. So I just went up to him and gave him a big hug, and he eventually held me back, patted my back, and...
So, that's enough of that.
Yes, that's it. Thank you, Lindsay. And I think him and Hayden shook hands. And I was just staring at him because I look a lot like Morris. So it just put this huge piece of the puzzle of my life into my head and into my body.
He would have had to have been moved underneath that kind of military bearing and and all of that. Could you detect that in him? Looking back now, do you think you can see that in his eyes, that he had to have been overwhelmed emotionally by the sight of his children? Surely,
I hope so.
You couldn't tell, really.
It was hard to tell in that moment. I mean, as we got to know him, he did tell us he loved us a lot. He clearly wanted us in his life, and On the way back to Fayetteville, driving back to Fayetteville, he took us to a house and stopped and said, "You see this house? I bought this house for you, your mum and I, for you to come over, but you never came." So he sort of, he would show us how he cared for us, if that makes sense, rather than deep sort of physical shows of affection.
How much do you think he and your mum had been in love back in the day?
Well, I know that my mum was deeply in love with him. She was head over heels. She always was her whole life. That was clear. And he said he really loved Mum.
And did you making contact with Morris mean that your mum was able to re-establish contact with Morris?
Yes, it did, yeah. And she did. Without telling Colin.
She was talking to him on the phone without Colin knowing?
Yeah, she re-established contact. And again, before the days of mobile phones, so it was, phone box calls.
Did Colin find out?
He did, because my mum got busted.
How did she get busted?
So she had made one of her phone box calls, and the day after, the police arrived on Val and Colin's doorstep asking whether their car had been in a certain vicinity the day before, because there'd been a crime committed in that area. So Mum had to say, yeah, our car was there. So, of course, that sparked a question from Colin. What was the car doing in that part of Peterborough? We never go there. So she had to fess up that she was back in contact with Morris.
Did they see each other again?
They never saw each other again. No.
After that, you met a man called Mike, an Australian. You married him, came to Australia, and found work as a sociologist in Australia. What kind of a relationship did you continue to have with Morris over those years?
Well, in the years leading up to me moving to Tasmania, I went over a few times. Morris's health was declining, unfortunately, at that point. I would go over to see him and eventually went to care for him for bouts of time. He remained quite closed, and he never sent me birthday cards or presents or acknowledged that, or Hayden or his nephews. Or it was very one way in a sense, which sort of spun me out a bit over that decade. I thought that finding him would settle me and settle my identity, but what it really did was spur another turmoil, I think, in me. He didn't acknowledge me in the way that I thought he might.
So you were thinking, I love you, but come on, old man, spark up?
Yeah. See, I'm being all British and polite, but that's exactly what it was. It was like, we weren't celebrated coming into the world, right? There was no stories about how, that we were welcomed, because I was hid away. And then finding my dad, I just thought, well, he'll celebrate me. And then I didn't really get anything back from him. I was going over to see him, but he wasn't reciprocating. So I sort of had another decade of self-loathing, I would say, or not really, just putting it all on me. But moving to Tassie, in that period up to then, I'd spent quite a bit of time with him because he was ill. He was really ill. He was in a nursing home.
And did he get a bit sweeter in his old age? The very old age?
Yeah, he mellowed a bit. He mellowed towards me a bit, and we made sure that he met Hagen came over he had 3 boys by then, so he came over and he loved to see his grandchildren. But his sternness to others still remained. Like he had a room in his nursing home, and he'd bribed the cleaner to put some "do not enter" tape across his door because he didn't want to deal with the other patients in the nursing home. So he just...
What do you think that comes from? Do you think, now you've had all these years to reflect I mean, he's an African-American guy in the Air Force in an era when there weren't a lot of African-Americans in the US Air Force as opposed to the infantry and perhaps the Navy as well. I don't know, is that a defensive front against racism or I don't know, do you have any theories on that? Or just was his way, just his natural way?
I think it was a bit of both. He was a successful man, really, in the southern states, which is not an easy path to take. And yes, I think being in the Air Force created this armour as well. But he was always known as, apparently when I talked to sort of our wider family, he was always known as guarded. Not a big chatter. When he spoke, everybody listened. He was an authoritative man that everybody loved in the family and felt he was really kind, but he didn't give much away. We actually found out when he died that he'd been married the whole time that he had me and Hayden. He'd actually got married the year before.
And he had a wife back in the States?
He had a wife in the States. For the whole period that he had Hayden and I, never mentioned it, and nobody else knew either.
So when he bought that house for your mum and you and your brother, he was willing to break up with that family at that point?
Well,
perhaps.
Again, yes, I found out after he died, I had to go through his papers, and he'd actually divorced his wife the year after Hayden was born. So yes, by the time he bought the house, he would have just divorced her. That poor woman.
So you're a sociologist and a senior public servant in Tasmania now. But being a sociologist, you'd have a kind of an awareness of just how messy people are and how messy families are. Absolutely. Has that helped you? Has that given you some perspective? It seems to me your whole life was directed towards trying to find a bigger picture to look at, to put your whole world and your history and your heritage in context. Has that really helped you do that? Yes, it absolutely has. It's completely given me a framework for that. You know, as you said, people are messy. You know, people don't behave rationally. God, no. No. They really don't. It's the big problem with economics. Economics assumes people do. Yeah, that's right. You know, and that just doesn't happen. That's just not how people act and behave. Everybody is flawed, you know, and everybody has generosity. I guess what I've learned really is that you have to look at people's kindness and their generosity and where that's generated from, and try and tap into that in people. Because most people have been through traumas, which can eat them up and can make them guarded about how they relate, how they live their lives. We all have that, and we don't see that when we meet people, but you can bring out people's kindness and generosity if, you know, you show them that too. I really appreciate you being so beautifully open with me, Lindsey. It's been so amazing talking to you and hearing your life story. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you, Richard, for the opportunity. Thank you. Lindsey Fidler is a sociologist and senior policy analyst in Tasmania. This program was made on the lands of the Gadigal, Jagera and Turrbal peoples. Producer was Alice Moldovan and executive producer Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Hi there, I'm Yumi Steins, host of the podcast Ladies, We Need to Talk. I'm really excited because I've got to let you know we have made a special mini-series all about perimenopause, which will be dropping from the great big ovaries in the sky every Tuesday for the next 4 weeks. We're looking at what's going on with our bodies, our brains and our sex lives during this phase of life. We'll also meet women who've gone into perimenopause at a young age. The Perimenopause Diaries on Ladies We Need to Talk. Catch the episodes on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.